All right, before we start, I have a few program announcements to make, and we will have additional information on the slides at the end, and that'll be sent out on the Slack as well after the course wraps. As you all probably know, this is the last week of live session, so thank you all for joining throughout the past few weeks, and we hope it's been useful for everyone and that you've been enjoying it. The deadline for all the quizzes and the post-test is September 1st, 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. If you have not submitted the pretest, you need to also do that by the deadline in order to be eligible for the course certificate. All these links will again be on the Slack. Sorry. To pass the course and receive the certificate, you need to submit both the pre and post tests and to pass at least 6 out of the 7 quizzes with a passing score of 80% for each quiz. Use the tracker link at bit.ly/drip-tracker to see the current course status, and write to Avnish on Slack or email us at dime_dripcourse at worldbank.org if you see any errors in your quiz statuses or if you have any questions about it. We will not be able to fix anything after September 3rd, which is the final day of the course. Everything is locked past then, so please, if you have any issues or questions, sort that with us through Slack or email before the course certificates are locked, as you will not be able to change anything afterwards. With that, again, thank you to everyone who has joined. Thank you to Avnish and to the rest of the DRIP team for the wonderful work everyone has done and for putting on such a fantastic and useful course. We look forward to hearing from everyone afterwards. And with that, we will get started with the last live session. Let me open up the Q&A so I can see it. Again, please ask questions through the Q&A. The chat is disabled and I cannot access the Slack while I'm giving the presentation. Chris and Avnish are here, and I think the others may join in the future, so they will be answering questions in the Q&A, and I will answer some live as the opportunity arises. So chapter 7, the final chapter of the book before the appendices, which you should also read, is called Publishing Reproducible Research Outputs. Again, I'm Benjamin Daniels, a research fellow at Georgetown University and a data coordinator with the Development Impact Evaluation DIME Analytics group here at the World Bank. And what we will talk about when we're publishing research outputs is basically what we all think of when we're doing research from the beginning. We're going to write a policy brief. We're going to write a paper. We're going to put something out into the world from all this data we've collected, summarizing our findings and communicating something new and vital to the research community. Our motivation for writing this section of the book and putting it in this place after everything else has already been done is the huge changes that you may have seen in the research community through the links that we had in the pre-session video. And if any of you are following the current course happening through Berkeley SIGA BITS, which is the reproducibility and transparency course, these expectations are now essential to most research outputs. Now, that doesn't mean just academic papers, right? It also means the policy outputs coming from us at the World Bank, from people who are working in think tanks, from people who are working in government. People expect to be able to see and reanalyze data. That is, I think, a highlight that everyone has seen throughout the past couple of years with public health tracking data. The amount of public scrutiny that's put on the actual materials that are done, and the expectation that that information will be released and reanalyzed. So no matter what kind of research you're doing or why you're doing it, we expect that outputs are accompanied by the release of data and code. This means that people who are relying on your research can obtain that material easily without having to jump through hoops to contact you. They can easily get your same results so that they can confirm that these are in line with their expectations. And they can, more importantly, use and reuse that material to learn from or to do future work off that builds on the work that you've already done. An essential way to say this is that the code and data are themselves valuable research outputs in addition to whatever your results may be. And we want to make those available for the public good. So actually putting these out there, the way that's going to happen is going to vary a lot. So I'm not going to give a ton of specific process information today, because that will depend on who you are, what kind of data you have, where you're publishing these materials. It'll depend on local laws. It'll depend on the rights and ownership that you have established over the data, which is why this is all downstream from the earlier processes of data collection and ethical research. So you should already have a sense of where your stuff is going to come out, where you can store and publish data, what rights you have to release it, and what kind of licensing you can provide when you put that out into the world. Importantly, data and code are typically handled separately at this point because they have different licensing and ownership structures. If you write code, either you or your employer or someone obvious will probably own that code, and you can typically license it broadly. It typically does not contain any information that could identify anyone, so it doesn't have to be redacted or reduced before releasing. So the code is typically very easy to publish and make available. Data, obviously, as I said, depends on where you got it, who it describes, how sensitive it is, who owns it, and all the other materials that we've talked through at length, which only you and your organization can control. If you're publishing with an official, with a third-party publisher, such as a journal or a book, releasing these materials is often your responsibility and is done separately from the release of any kind of research outputs, such as text and manuscripts. But if you're working in a scientific journal, the typical policy now for journals who are requiring the release of data and code will be that they will either verify that you've published these. Usually, they won't host these materials themselves at this point in time, although that may change. So, following our overarching theme of transparency, reproducibility, and credibility, basically you should be ready to do this at this point. Your original data will already be archived, and you'll already understand the licenses and ownership rights you have and can issue over it. You'll already have created the documentation for any original data that you obtained or created. Your data processing code will be stored separately with the clean data that it creates in the prior stages. And your final data, your constructed data, and your analytical code will be stored together without other materials that aren't necessary to the research product. When you actually set about doing this, the task division breaks down as usual. The principal investigators or team leads are going to oversee the production of all these outputs and make sure that they are in the right place, have the documentation and legal information necessary for them, and understand the rights and responsibilities of the team. They'll also obviously determine where things are submitted and how they're going to be published, and they'll make sure that things are working properly. As usual, the research assistant or the staff will do all of this. They will work up the code, data, and documentation to meet the requirements of the publisher or publication objectives, manage the production process for any documents that are actually written up as text outputs, and work with comments, feedback, editing from either internally to your organization, reviewer comments, basically anything that needs to be reworked over time. The research assistants and staff will also do and support publication production tasks. So just to get a sense of who's with us today, I want to ask who's working with research papers here and who's published a research paper before. That question should be open on the Poll EV site. So please go to pollev.com/DIME-analytic981 to answer the prompts. I just want to get a sense here of who's working with academic research publication and who's working more with policy publication. So you can kind of interpret this question that way for my own benefit. Is that working there? Yes, there's a couple of responses coming in. While y'all do that, let me, Chris is writing answer to a question. And Chris is a very good source for this information. So he'll be answering a question about re-identifying data. Great, so it looks like we're about, I'd say about 50-50 research and policy, which is wonderful because that's what we hope to make this course accessible to people doing any types of development empirics. Let's move on here. And let me ask if, for those who are out there, you know, either as producers or consumers of research, have you created or used reproducibility package before? So you see there's some overlapping options here. So please just go ahead and answer that while I respond to some of the Q&A. So Vaishali asks, when publishing in research journals, is it necessary to publish data or it depends on the study? They've come across many papers that provide no access to data. So as we kind of pointed out, and we hope to convince you guys, we are a little bit ahead of the curve here at DIME Analytics. That's kind of our job, and we take pride in that. There are absolutely many papers that provide no access to data, and we think that that is inappropriate, and we think most of the research community tends to agree with us. However, producing data that is ready to access is difficult. As we have you know, written on in the book and tried to work through in the courses here, making data that is ready to release takes some organization on your side, right? It takes being aware of what those what your rights and responsibilities are to release it, and then doing the work to make sure that the data is actually safe to release. Many people don't put in that work, and many journals still don't require it. But in our fields, at least, especially led by AEA, led by the teams at BITS and others, they are requiring that data be made available to access, or if that's not possible, at a minimum, providing instructions for how people would get the data. So if, for example, you're working with proprietary or government data, obviously you can't publish that and give it to other people. You may be allowed to publish, you know, basically constructed data sets, derived information for the research. You may not, but at least you have to provide information saying, hey, we got this information from this source, and you have, in order to obtain it, you have to ask them directly. So that's available. But in most cases, you know, where data is collected by our teams, we own that data, and we have a responsibility to clean it up and make that available as a research output. So most people here have not created or used a reproducibility package. Otherwise, it looks like people mostly have used them rather than created them, which is great. Like we said, the environment is changing. So let's get into how we're going to actually build these outputs, starting with the reproducibility, starting with the written materials themselves. So to first take a step back from data and code, we'll start with the written materials that typically make up what people before or until recently thought of as the research. Papers, manuscripts, books, policy briefs, that kind of thing. Today, most of these things are multi-author. We started talking a bit about dynamic documents in the last week's session, and I want to return to that now because this is a big part of what the people out in the audience say who are writing research papers are going to be doing. Most of these have a lot of authors, in addition to having authors, there may be additional staff and assistants who are non-authors who are working on technical elements of creating written text. We really, really strongly ask you all to not email Word documents back and forth. It's fine if you're a single author and you're trying to get feedback from others, but large teams quickly get confused, lose information, make mistakes, and it's in general a very poor process for collating inputs from a large number of people. Everyone's seen this document here in the picture with stacking up comments, comments getting deleted, changes getting re-overwritten, and basically unable to track that or handle it beyond a very small number of team members. As we referred in the last session, dynamic documents instead let you organize your outputs, right? In particular, in Office software, if you are using tables and figures, they're embedded in the document, and they need to be manually updated one by one every time they're reproduced. Inevitably, you make mistakes. It also takes a lot of work to get the formatting right. Copying tables in from an arbitrary statistical software into Office is basically impossible to do well. I've never seen it done well. You may have heard that there are plugins or other ways to do this in Office natively. I promise you there isn't. It does not work. If it works for you, it does not work for your co-authors, and it will break at some point when everyone thinks it's working and all the results will be out of date. So we really don't think that this can be done. As we started discussing, and as you may have seen in the other introduction, the other materials that we shared before the session, we use a software called Latex to build these documents automatically with updated outputs. So in addition to storing the writing, which works well collaboratively through various systems that we've provided and which I'll build on in a second, you're writing very simple code in most cases. You can see that highlighted here, that point directly to the files that you want included in the document. The LaTeX compiler, through whichever software you're using, brings that in automatically and respects that formatting and make sure it's always the most recent version of the output. So the texts are updated and easy to manage, and the exhibits are always updated and easy to manage. Now, we at Dime use this for almost all of our outputs, from the smallest policy briefs to the largest papers. And it's become a standard software and a standard requirement that people joining the team know how to use LaTeX effectively and do so. While there is absolutely a learning curve to it, it is basically an academia-wide standard, and it's now considered a basic skill to be able to do this. If you and your team are just getting started in LaTeX, there's basically two ways that we offer or think of collaboration approaches. So there are now some pretty good online services that are similar to, but not identical to, Google Docs, because obviously there's this underlying code materials. The one that we have seen most commonly, and I think is the market leader in academia, is this one called Overleaf. There are free approaches that allow most people to, most teams to work effectively online without paying anything for it. But advanced features like tracking changes, having unlimited version histories, and sync tools are usually offered on a premium tier here. So we think this is this type of tool is a good way to get used to writing in LaTeX. They also offer a lot of guides on how to accomplish different functionalities, and we find that generally useful. However, to get more advanced features, we typically want to take it offline and not use a web-based material. So just like any other code that we're writing, we use distributed services such as Git and GitHub to synchronize these written materials across the different team members' computers. And And each one can then use a tech program such as Tech Studio locally to compile materials as needed. So this requires some basic Git knowledge, but it is generally not as complex as even working with statistical code. So again, by a short amount of time with us, we do expect that research assistants would have the ability to do this. So it requires some comfort. So we don't expect that people joining will immediately be able to work through a distributed service writing tech with Git. But it is one of the first things that we teach and expect people to learn and pick up on, to be able to contribute to research outputs, briefs, and manuscripts, since it is so important. So now that you all had this kind of introduction to it since last week and this week, what are some other advantages that I may have missed in dynamic documents or problems that you've had that would be useful to have technical solutions to? While we add some responses there so I can have some discussion points, I see that there is, let's see if there's anything answered in the Q&A that's worth discussing further. Technical stuff. I'll let this one for a minute. Security is. So security is an interesting question. We generally don't worry too much about people stealing our work. Yeah, efficiency and error prevention are excellent because that's really what we're talking about here. Automated updating, yes. So really, these are excellent responses, right? As with everything else, our biggest interest in DIME analytics is making things easy for people, right? We never want to make a workflow where people are working harder just because we tell them that they have to do things a certain way. We always want to make things easier and more flexible once you have some simple basic skills. So we don't talk about having a steep learning curve or having to take advanced course in these things. And all of these responses are great, and exactly the reasons why we talk about dynamic documents as being the standard for producing these outputs here at DIME. So these are great. Yes, all this flexibility. We have can easily share things with new people. There's no tracking back through emails or comments for materials or previous work. Yes, fantastic. So thank you for that. Let me now move forward to the second portion of publishing materials, which is publishing research data. I know there will be lots of questions about these, since this is one of the most novel elements for most people and for the community as a whole. So again, to reiterate, we consider original data collected during a research project to be a research output. It's something of value that you created through your work, that your funders funded, that your government funded, that your organization funded, that is really valuable and can't be got by anyone else. Now, original data may have access requirements for embargoes. It may be private. It may have been provided by a partner under strict conditions about redistribution, but it must be archived for safekeeping within your organization. You should have either physical storage hard drives or digital storage in a secured system, such as the World Bank uses OneDrive, for example, that is encrypted and accessible only to members of the research team, where you can store the full information that was collected or provided as an archival copy. But we also want to be able to put some record of that data out there, at the very least, so people can see what data sets were used in your project. Publications are moving towards requiring you to cite those data sets rather than just to say a paragraph saying, hey, we got some data from X government or X survey. We actually want to have a, some kind of reference to the exact materials that were used. And data accessibility statements, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a statement of how someone can get access to that data. Again, they're not requiring that data be published, since it's not always possible, but you need to say how someone could get the information or reproduce the research. Either they can contact the government, they can contact us and fill out a licensing and non-disclosure form, or the data is publicly accessible here, here, and here. Some way, instructions that people could get the exact materials needed to reproduce the study. So again, what I'm trying to say is that this should be easy. Data simply needs to be preserved, and some record of it needs to be created. You can see the World Bank's microdata library there as the example of that we use institutionally to create a record of the data sets that are used and held, even if they are in the cases that are shown here, even if they're not publicly released online. Now, original data has to have clear licensing. There are lots of example frameworks. Your organization should know what works for you in your context. The most essentials, and here's an example of the various tiers that the World Bank offers. Licensing is, as it is in most cases, it is a statement of the permissions that someone accessing the data, how the data can be accessed, and then what it can be used for. So the critical step here is understanding how data is owned, depending where you got it from, who else you're working with, and knowing your rights and responsibilities over that data. Can you redistribute it openly? Can you redistribute it at all? Are there portions that can't be redistributed? Are there portions that you don't own? Again, it's super important and should be resolved before data is obtained, so that before you get to this stage, you already know what you're allowed to do with the data and are set up to do it without going back and trying to untie legal knots. In every case, you will need to, if you are going to be releasing data, you also need to de-identify that data before making it available. So even if all the direct personally identifying information has been removed from the data set, there are many variables or combinations of variables that could what we call re-identify people. One of the materials in this week's pre-course materials is a simple paper about re-identification, making the point that if you have small localities and combinations of simple demographics like age and gender, it's very likely that these combinations become unique quickly. That is, given an area small enough, in the paper posted, it's a US zip code, which are very relatively small areas. And then given simply someone's birth date and gender, you can usually find the exact person. There's usually not more than one person with that exact birthday and gender in a given US zip code. So a very small amount of information can quickly become equivalent to giving out people's names and addresses. Tools like SDC Micro, which are provided free of charge and are available, help you assess and reduce this risk. There are lots of strategies that can help you reduce this risk. For example, masking exact birth dates and leaving only years. For example, top coding things like income. For example, masking small location identifiers, since it's usually not necessary to know exactly which one people are in, just to know who's in the same one. So US zip codes, for example, would be recoded to random but unique identifiers. This will vary, obviously, depending on the project and the context, And so it's important that you take a moment to think about what variables and what combinations could be used to make these re-identifications. I work largely with health data, so we have a list of, again, in the US, it's called HIPAA is the governing regulation. And there's a list of what are called HIPAA identifiers, which have to be purged from data in all cases. And that's a very good list to go with for health data. And I recommend looking at that to get a sense of the kinds of things and the kinds of approaches that can be used to removing data that can be used to re-identify people. The next step in publishing data is the constructed data, the final data, the analytical data, whatever you call it, the materials that you use for the actual analytical work. Now, this is different from the clean original data because this should only have exactly those variables and observations which are needed for the work, right? This is the final data for the particular research output. This includes the code that's required to create that data from that original data, which again is published in a separate location as its own output. The final data and this final constructing code is part of the research reproducibility package and goes with that research product. So this package may or may not be governed by copyright rules of your organization or your publisher. Just check that and how you're expected to prepare and release these. As I said, many scientific journals ask that you publish this separately through either OSF, ICPSR, OpenICPSR, other archival sites with specific licenses. I've been required to put materials out using CC0, which is a public domain license. And typically you will have those rights over the code here, if not the data. If you don't have those rights over the data, what you will include is the code that is required to go from the original data to the final data, but not include any data in this package. And then the data availability statement will let people know how they can obtain the data. Then your code will work and people will be able to reproduce your final data needed for analysis. So you have that sense of this really a reproducibility package in the truest sense, is that starting from wherever you started, people can get to wherever you got to. With all data, essential functionality is creating documentation. We created IE Codebook, which was also included in the pre-session readings for this week, which is our preferred method of documenting the contents of data sets quickly and easily so people can see what is in them. So for those of you who use reproducibility packages, accessed published data before, let's talk about stuff that's often missing, because this is a process that we are continuously working to improve to make sure that we're releasing complete and usable packages. And so please go ahead and if you've used that before, let me know something that you have wanted to see in a data release that's not been there. Codebooks.
Hey Ben, I don't think we see the results in a folder when you are, and I don't know why.
They're not showing up?
They're not showing up. Did you present in a different way this time?
No.
Okay, yes, I don't think we have time to fix this, but like just make sure that you describe what you see on your screen extra carefully. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. Obviously, documentation codebook is the biggest one coming up. Those definitely need to be there. I have seen an inordinate number of very low quality pieces of documentation and code books, which are very hard to match back to the data. And that's, excuse me, one of the biggest things that we have focused on making easier. There are some things that people are mentioning that are interesting, which are lists of papers, and original data. Now, the original data should always be published. If that's not published, then we don't have really anything to talk about. That should definitely be out there. And here's an interesting one, how missing data points have been addressed. So here's another point where we're going to start talking a little bit more about separation between the original data and the final data. In original data, if there are missing data points, right, they should remain missing in the data release because that's the data. In final data, how those are addressed should be included in the code that is released there. So that should be depending on what stage we're talking about here. And yeah, a lot of these are hit the same points, and that's exactly right. So let me move forward here to the next step, to stop talking about data, and we'll come back to any more questions at the end of the session, and talk about publishing a reproducible research package. So now we're talking about the information materials required to re-obtain your research output. So as I said a few moments ago, this may or may not include the data directly, depending on your permissions and licenses. But in any case, it'll include the code needed to create that final data and the code needed to analyze that final data, as well as the documentation for it, the research outputs themselves, and any terms of use and licensings that these materials require. So we expect that these will be mapped one-to-one with research outputs. So if you have a manuscript, it should be accompanied by a reproducibility package. There's no other correspondence, right? This reproducibility package won't work for any other manuscript, and that manuscript won't refer to any other reproducibility package. So this makes, and the purpose of that is making each output independent and protected from future changes. Now, there may be changes further up in the process, right? There can be revisions to data, there can be new releases of data sets, there can be other outputs that, for example, address missing values or other definitions in a different way. Those will be separate, right? If you do a different research project, even if you make changes to the way that the data is handled, it gets a separate reproducibility package, so it can be seen how those are handled. And these should never be basically broken by future work. So the core element, as we said here, is that code, right? That analysis code that, as we went through last week, has the two functions of creating analysis data and analyzing analysis data. So it's super important that that code is clear. The code, like the data, is a research output in and of itself. And this means that you need to take the time to treat it like it is one. You edit your manuscripts, you have someone read your manuscripts, you have someone make sure that that they're understandable and functional, and you should do the same with your code. Here is a repository that I had for a paper that came out recently. It's organized well. It has readmes indicating how to use the code, and it's archived using Zenodo, which isn't shown here, but it creates a permanent archive of a GitHub repository. So that's my preferred process at this stage. So code at this point should be re-edited and updated so that it's modular, which is what means that you can create each output without necessarily running all of the code. So here's an example where if you want to create figure 1, you can run just the section for figure 1 and get figure 1. It doesn't depend on any modifications that are made anywhere else in the code. The data is final, meaning it can be loaded and analyzed directly without additional creation of materials. And it's easy to understand where to find figure 1. If I have the figure, I can find the code. If I have the code, I can find the figure it corresponds to. So that's what we mean by modular and well-organized code at this stage. If things are complex, you might want to have more or fewer separate script files. You don't necessarily need to. I mean, unfortunately, it's hard to prescribe directly, but it's the kind of Goldilocks problem. You want them to be not too long, not too short, that it's a pain, but just right, the just right amount of code in each file. It does require separating data construction from analysis, which we've discussed already extensively. Loading or using the data fresh in each section for each output, and making code easy to navigate and understand by using formatting and syntax to make it clear to the reader. Releasing this package, like I said, should be done through an archival service. The ones that we've seen broadly here are OSF, OpenICPSR, Zenodo, and Dataverse. Here is an example of a package that I recently put out on Zenodo for a paper. It simply takes the GitHub repository and freezes a snapshot of it so that you have an archival version of it that can't be changed or deleted, even if I delete my GitHub and disappear from the internet. Again, you have to specify licensing terms for these materials. Code can very often be put in the public domain. You usually own it, and it's usually not identifying. Obviously, use your brain when doing so, but that is the general expectation from my experience, that these materials would put in the public domain. Also, they should be documented. Zenodo is free, I believe. Yes, I've never paid anything for it, so I think at least this service is. That's a repeat of the last question. So actually, we want to be wrapping up here. So applying these lessons to your project. DIME analytics throughout, all of the members of the team have emphasized that these workflows, even though they may be new to you, and even though they require learning some additional skills, they're designed to make everything easier. If you've done everything up to this point the way, in the manner that we've discussed, with the mindset that we've discussed, this stuff should be easy. All of our workflows from the beginning of the research project are designed with making publication easy, because that is the goal of our researchers, is to get that knowledge out there, right? We are a knowledge bank. We produce public goods in the form of information. That information is research results. That information is original data. That information is useful code. That is a big part of what we do in the research department and at DIME. So DIME Analytics has taken its mission to make that easy for our team to do. Everything leads up to this point. When you're designing projects, when you're mapping out the project data needs, when you're collecting data, when you're analyzing data, when you're constructing new data, and when you're writing analysis files. The reason we ask for that all to be done in such a structured way leading up to this point is so that you can get these products done efficiently and quickly, reproducibility, transparently, and get them out to the world. And these principles apply no matter whether you're an academic researcher in our department, whether you're at a university or other research institution, whether you're at a think tank, whether you're at a government. Whenever you're using data to try and influence the world, which is all the time, we want that to be done well and provide tools that make it easy for you. So that's what this is all about. Everything should already be well written and well organized, since we ask people to do that from the get-go. Everything should already have licensing, ownership, and privacy controls prepared, or at least thought of in advance so they can be implemented smoothly. And everything should be easy to write and move forward with, since you have an analysis plan and well-organized results for your project. So that's, really our hope here. I just went all the way back to the start by clicking the wrong button. And so let me just wrap up some final housekeeping stuff here, and then I will take questions for the last 10 minutes. All the links that people will need to complete any materials for the course are on this slide, which will get posted after the session closes. The course materials are all posted publicly and will stay up there forever. The overview doc, that's on the OSF. The overview doc has a guide to the course, including the links to all of the quizzes, which are, again, due next week. I'll reiterate that on the next slide. The course tracker, which is open until the close of the course for you all to make sure that things are submitted so that you can be eligible for the course certificate. The pre-test and post-test are both linked. These must both be completed by the deadline as well. And finally, since this is the last session and we have one more week for you all to finish the materials, we would like to take the time to ask you for a little bit of feedback on the course. So the link is here, bit.ly/drip-feedback. It's a very short feedback form, but will help us improve this course and our materials for both you and for future participants. So please take a second to pay that forward so that we can make this better for everyone, especially since the book is brand new and we hope you've all enjoyed it immensely. We love to know what we can do to make that experience and information more valuable and accessible for everyone. So the final logistical elements here. This is, as we said, the last week of live sessions. Again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to the DRIP team. Thank you so much to Avnish for the wonderful coordination. Thank you all for coming, and we hope it's been a valuable experience. Week 8 next week, ending on September 3rd, is for all of you to take the time to complete any quizzes as well as the post-test. These are all required in order to receive the course certificate. The deadline for the quizzes and the post-test is September 1st, 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. So please check that. These are not, as you know, long materials. So please get those in. If you haven't done the pre-test, you must do that. The criteria to pass the course is the pre and post tests. There's no required score for these, but they need to be submitted. And pass at least 6 of the 7 quizzes with a score of 80% for each quiz. Use the tracker, write to Avnish on Slack or email us at the email listed here if there are any errors or questions about these statuses. Nothing can be updated after September 3. So again, the deadline is September 1st. And everything is frozen on September 3rd. So please do not be late with coming to us if you have any questions or concerns. That's all. Again, thank you very much for joining, and I will put the last 10 minutes towards answering questions in the Q&A. So yeah, let me scan through the ones that have been answered and see if there's anything worth re-upping. Here's a very good one from early in the session, actually. So re-identification, adding noise to data. I'll read Chris's response here in case people haven't seen it. So re-identification of data is similar to the process we mentioned before, right? When you have a small amount of data, it can very quickly uniquely identify someone. Another way this can be done is if you include something that seems innocuous, like say income, but there's another data set out there that links people to their incomes, right? So it can become possible with a very small amount of additional data, and that data may be public, to find out who people are using material that isn't in and of itself sensitive. So say, for example, I released a data set that had sensitive information, such as refugee statuses and immigration statuses and income. None of these are identifying on their own, although they are sensitive. The issue is that if another non-sensitive data set was simply income and people's names, you would now be able to link the sensitive information about refugee and immigration statuses to specific people. So when we have information that can very quickly identify individuals uniquely, such as exact income levels, we use masking approaches to hide some of that variation. So the second part of the question here is about adding noise to data. So there are lots of ways to do it. As Chris points out, there are many resources on it and many approaches. There is simple binning, right? There is adding noise. Basically, there are lots of ways to remove the uniqueness of any of these fields, which will stop them being linked to other data sources, to existing data, or from identifying people uniquely. So let's go back to the Q&A and see what we have open here. Can you publish as an anonymous individual without linking yourself to the publication? There's no reason that I'm aware of that an author cannot be anonymous. I imagine that you would have to, have an extensive communication with the publisher about how you are going to do that, since they would presumably still need to have your correspondence on file. I think that would be a question for a publisher if an author wanted to remain anonymous. At the same time, it might be for the same kind of reasons, it might be difficult to do in practice, since it is often quite easy to find out who has access to particular types of data or information. So it is probably quite easy to re-identify authors in many of these cases when things like grant financing or any kind of dissemination of the work would be impossible, right? So that would be my answer. But there's no reason not to have a conversation with the publisher if there's something that would be valuable for. Anything else that's answered that I want to pop up? I've seen published data where treatment status is removed. It's de-identified, etc., but I don't see why we should remove a treatment status variable. So when we would publish, so this is an interesting question, which I think comes back to the separation of original and final data. So if we're publishing original data, we often would not be including the treatment status at that stage because we're simply publishing the results of a survey. The treatment status would be part of the research product, right? So it's stored in these master files that we have separate from a survey or something, and it's included, it's merged and included into final research data. So we won't necessarily release details about specific experiments or studies with original data when it's collected from a partner or from a survey, because that isn't collected in that data. It's not part of that data. So it'll always be released, as Chris says, the treatment status will always be released with the reproducibility package for a given research product. But it generally, unless it's derived from the original data, wouldn't be included in the publication of the original data, if that makes sense. Let's see, there's two new ones. Certificates, I'll let you handle those. LaTeX information. Yeah, as usual, we'll get these responses published up. There's a lot of great links for learning LaTeX here. There's links for working on these materials in these answers, which we will make sure get out to everyone so you can access these before any time. Clarification. What do we mean by reproducible results? Does someone run these vendors? Right. So the answer is yes. Someone running the reproducibility package should get the exact numbers from your publication to exact precision. The materials that are published should produce your paper without any changes or variations. Again, if there's data masking or adding noise, this will be done at an earlier step and would usually be included in the data that you use. So if, for example, data was masked at the original data step, you'll be using that masked data in your final research. So you'll still be getting the exact numbers. Now, the only time this might not be true is if you're using data that is very sensitive or very personally identifying, for example, GPS coordinates, and really can't release it. So we've talked about some approaches to doing that, which include, licensed or restricted access, contractual or non-disclosure agreements to re-release exact data to others so that it can be reproduced exactly, and you will have the code that will reproduce that exactly. We also, talk about alternative approaches such as if you don't need the underlying information, right? You don't need to know exact incomes, you don't need to know exact GPS coordinates, but you only need derivative measures such as changes in income or distances between things. You should still be able to reproduce exact figures, even if you don't, even if that data would be masked if it were released. So there's a variety of ways to answer that question. Another one is that, a lot of times we aren't using, things aren't that sensitive, the important things, or they can't be matched. So we try to take that into consideration when putting these things together, and you can always include notes in the cases where you won't be able to reproduce exactly. But honestly, I've never seen a very small minority of results depend on things that have to be masked at the release stage, in my opinion. Again, obviously, if you're working with especially sensitive data, that may vary case by case. But yeah, no, in general, we expect exact replication, or at least that the code would reproduce exactly if they had access to the underlying data. And that's really the gold standard for it. Okay, for reproducibility, does one need an identical local environment? So I'm sure Chris will provide some additional technical details here. In general, there are a few parameters that you need to have identically. Obviously, you need the same software from the same software version, but in most cases that are not highly specialized, you should be able to go on my GitHub or on the World Bank GitHub or on any of the Zenodo packages, download the materials to any standard desktop, using Stata or R, using Windows or Mac, if the materials are there, and get the exact same results. So identical local environment to a point, but a pretty broad point in modern with modern computing. Future courses, I don't know that we have immediate plans for future courses since this takes a lot of work, but we do run annual courses that have practical components. We run managed successful impact evaluation surveys. Every year we run various courses on a one-off basis. We'll always have the announcements posted, and we'll always have our materials posted on our OSF. So please, feel free to browse through our OSF. You can already go there and access other materials. These are included in an appendix to the book. So you can always access our tools, our courses, our practice materials. The exact same trainings that we offer to anyone who joins our team are always made publicly available through that repository. They are linked to the appendix in the book. They're not hard to find. Are we going to run this course again probably next year? Possibly. We haven't written up the schedule for the end of next year yet. I don't know yet. But we will certainly announce it when we do. We certainly hope to, since we've created all the materials and we have the research, the team together for it. So with that, I don't see any more questions on today's material. So I'm going to stop sharing and give everyone again one more big thank you. And if there is nothing else, we will close this up. Send the materials out, and hope you all gained a lot from this, and thank you all for attending and participating. It's been wonderful to see you all. Luisa, Chris, Avnish, anything that you want to add? Well, it's been wonderful
for everyone for the past few weeks. It was great to have you. Sorry, Ben, you were adding something.
I was just going to say that you all have done a wonderful job as well, and it's been great seeing everyone put this together. So thank you all as well. Big round of applause to the team.
A huge thank you to everyone for being so thoroughly engaged.
All right.
Bye, everyone.